The People of the Secret. Chapter 8. Gurdjieff. The idea of a directing influence behind the historical process has not gone entirely unsuspected. In Napoleonic times, the French group who called themselves the Sofians obviously suspected something of the kind, and it led them to search for a directing source in the East. However, after 6 years, they concluded that the initiative lay with those who directed such matters and not with aspirants, however well-intentioned. They decided that all their efforts had been a waste of time, and with remarkable candor they said so and wound up their society. In recent times, Louis Spence has noticed significant elements in history and has tried to link them together in the occult causes of the present war. A most ambitious, though not perhaps very perceptive effort on the same lines was made by a group said to be apostate Freemasons in London in the 1930s, published anonymously as The Trail of the Serpent. The author has recently been tentatively identified as Mrs. H.T. Stoddart, a member of the Golden Dawn. Such inquiries necessarily begin with the only material available, that is, those parts of genuine operations which become visible after the original occasion has been abandoned and the medium is in decay. Such studies as Louis Spence's and the anonymous author of The Trail of the Serpent illustrate, if nothing else, the essential invisibility of the material they are trying to detect. As we have tried to suggest, genuine operations, once terminated, leave traces invested with powerful energies. These act as a magnet for well-intentioned ordinary people who seek to perpetuate what is in effect an empty form. It has been claimed that virtually all occultism known to the West is of this variety. Such pseudo-movements are involuntary. The personality, negative emotions, vanity and wish-fulfillment urges of those involved proceed, as in ordinary life, to mechanical and perhaps finally destructive ends. Due, however, to the illuminating and magnifying nature of the original idea to which they are attached, such organizations have an apparent vitality much in excess of ordinary social and political groupings. Since it is only remainder forms which are available for investigation, it is not surprising that such inquiries as have been attempted converge on some theory of an historical influence which is for the most part sinister. According to the author of The Trail of the Serpent, the higher grades of all Hermetic societies require that the adept be enslaved by some astute outside mind or group of minds, which, it would seem, seek to rule the nations through hypnotically controlled adepts. For one and all of these modern mysteries are ruled by some unknown hierarchy. Louis Spence moves tentatively to the conclusion that some evil forces permeate European Freemasonry, but not English Freemasonry, concluding, for example, that Cagliostro engineered the French Revolution for the advantage of a sinister Illuminist group opposed to monarchy. The Trail of the Serpent starts by collecting facts, but finishes by attributing most of humanity's woes to the Jews and the Elders of Zion. Pauwels and Bergier see the Russian Red Dragon Society contriving the Russian Revolution and the assassination of the Tsar, and Haushofer with Gruppe Thule animating the empty shell of Hitler in a bid to provoke a satanic apocalypse. He will dance, but we will play the tune. It is probably safe to assert that all attempts to discern and connect to the elements, which might provide a unified theory of history, must fail so long as inquiries are confined to the visible shadows and not the invisible substance. The substance, however, has a built-in invisibility, or so it seemed till very recently. Since the early 1950s, a great deal of hitherto unknown material has become available, and in the nature of things, this cannot have happened by accident. If it has leaked, it is because those in charge of it have decided to leak it. Separately, the various hints amount to little. Taken together, they suggest, for the first time, the nature of the organization, long suspected but never identified, which is concerned with injecting developmental possibilities into the historical process at certain critical points. On the basis of internal evidence, it may be legitimate to suggest that this organization is the expression of one of the centers inferred by J.G. Bennett as directing the evolution of the whole human race. 12,000 years ago, these centers withdrew for some 80 generations to prepare for the debut of modern man. The suggestion is that one of these, immediately responsible for the West, has decided to come, partially at least, into the open in the second half of the 20th century. It may be that the intellectual development of the West is now at such a stage that the parent can only guide the offspring further by taking it into its confidence. To glimpse the steps by which the first hints of this have passed into the public domain, and to guess at the possible purpose of such action, it will be necessary to go back to last century and to the little Caucasian town of Alexandropol. There, in 1872, was born George Ivanovich Gurdjieff, certainly one of the most remarkable figures ever to appear in the West. The Caucasus region has been a mixing bowl of cultures for thousands of years. European, Slavonic, Turkish, Roman, Mongol, Persian, and even more ancient cultures have flooded into this area and then receded, each leaving some contribution. It was into this fusion of influences that Gurdjieff was born. His family were Greeks who had emigrated from Caesarea in the 16th century. His father was a bard whose recitations preserved legends of remote antiquity, including Assyrian and Sumerian traditions. It was these that probably first suggested to Gurdjieff the idea of some hidden influence that linked all the generations of men in a way ordinarily unsuspected. Late in life, he discovered that the archaeological recovery and translation of ancient cuneiform inscriptions endorsed in minutest detail the account of ancient history preserved in his father's poems. In other words, there exists an unsuspected oral transmission of history as accurate and at least as enduring as any orthodox historical record. As a youth, Gurdjieff became obsessed with the idea that there was a purpose and aim behind human life which was hardly ever glimpsed in the ceaseless generations of man. He became convinced that in former epochs men had possessed genuine knowledge of such matters, and that this knowledge was still preserved somehow, somewhere. Together with a number of others, like-minded with himself, Gurdjieff began a search, lasting decades, for traces of this knowledge. His society of seekers, singly and in groups, went on pilgrimages to remote places where traces of this ancient knowledge might survive. The members, some actual, some possibly allegorical, met at intervals of years to compare results. Their survey took in Africa, Persia, Turkestan, Tibet, India, and the Far East as far as Malaya. Some of his friends were killed. Some remained with brotherhoods they had discovered in unimaginably remote corners of the world. Gurdjieff and some others made a contact which they regarded as significant in the highest degree, and they underwent a long and arduous training. This period seems to have finished by about 1908, and during his lifetime, nothing appears to have been known about his activities between 1908 and his appearance in Moscow in 1914. There he occupied the role of teacher and gathered round him a group which included the Russian writer and philosopher P.D. Ouspensky. The subsequent activities of Gurdjieff and his pupils is given in Ouspensky's In Search of the Miraculous, and in a flood of books by pupils, former pupils, and interested bystanders published in recent years. During his period in France, Gurdjieff came under scrutiny by many intellectuals of the West, who tried to assess what was going on in the only terms available, their own. The result is a motley collection of impressions and assessments which variously show Gurdjieff as a superman, a magician, and something like a madman. He had an incredible capacity for puncturing people's egoism and was seemingly wholly unconcerned about the vituperation this produced. If there is one impression common to all, it is that Gurdjieff was not an ordinary man. He possessed powers which ordinary people did not possess, and he had an aim before which all other considerations were wholly unimportant. And those who were close to Gurdjieff for longer than a single afternoon are unanimous in testifying to the extraordinary effect he had upon them, outraging all ordinary standards of good manners and behavior, and sometimes using language which by social standards was unpardonable. He could nevertheless leave an impression of some unbearable nostalgia, a hint of some unknown level of humanity, an impression of holiness. The experience of meeting Gurdjieff could never be forgotten. For years, while earning a living as a businessman in Paris, he conducted his classes at Fontainebleau, supervised the coming and going of thousands of pupils from all over the world, taught his dance movements and his music, and wrote 2 books and part of a third. The first book, All and Everything, which was in proof before his death, October 29, 1949, probably confirmed the literary world in its belief that Gurdjieff could be written off as a madman. But behind the extravagance of language, the deliberate confusion of chronology, and the absurd allegories of ravens as space scientists, there is a significance which is certainly not to be appraised superficially. The drama of the universal process, the nature of time, and an exposition of the transflux energies associated with life are linked to a cosmology that is mind-daunting. There is every reason to believe that Orage and C.S. Knott are right, and that All and Everything is a work of objective art comparable to the Mahabharata. The book produces effects upon the reader at several levels. On people whose lives have been based entirely on the satisfactions of personality, the effect is sometimes overwhelming. Gurdjieff was often asked about the source of his system and the origins of the teaching it contained. This he would never divulge, but sometimes pointed to the indications contained in his second series of writings, Rencontres avec des hommes remarquables. This carried the suggestion that the members of Gurdjieff's Society of Seekers had traveled in virtually unexplored areas of Central Asia. Gurdjieff's people all over the world included writers, scientists, artists, doctors, and professionals of many kinds. Many of them sensed that in All and Everything there were revelations about the mechanism of nature which could be translated into practice in the technological world of the 20th century. A quarter of a century after his death, this appears to be happening. Ideas, all unacknowledged, have crept into psychology, which clearly derive from All and Everything. In England and America, a new science of structural communication is being applied to such diverse activities as teaching machines and naval strategy. This, though the origin is not suspected by educationalists or industrialists, derives from Gurdjieff's occult teaching. In the early years before Gurdjieff's death, all was confusion among the many Gurdjieff groups from England, America, France, Germany, and elsewhere. Several successors to Gurdjieff appeared, all implicitly or explicitly claiming that they had been given the charter by G himself. People who for years had worked on themselves to transcend ordinary personality limitations behaved in thoroughly unobjective ways. There was name-calling and vituperation. There was, on one hand, a tendency to look outward, and, on the other hand, a tendency slavishly to continue the work taught by Gurdjieff himself. Behind most of this there was probably fear. Most sincere pupils realized that their studies and practice had taken them beyond the most childish patterns of ordinary personality behavior, but they had not for the most part reached a level from which they could make further progress on their own. Some of the most independent people sought to meet the next phase halfway if there was a next phase. Many elaborate deductions were made. In All and Everything it was related, for example, that 7 centuries before the Babylonian events, a genuine messenger had incarnated on earth. His name was Ashiata Shamash. This most very saintly, now already common cosmic individual, had concluded after very long deliberation that all the methods used by genuine messengers in the past, namely one or other of the sacred impulses of faith, hope, and love, were no longer applicable. Certain accretions in the soul body of humanity had become so dense that the inspiration of a messenger employing one of the familiar sacred impulses was no longer adequate to achieve the catharsis from which evolution could proceed. Ashiata Shamash decided that conscience alone remained uncontaminated in the human presence, and he proceeded therefore to work on methods of activating conscience. This chapter in All and Everything had always made a profound impression on people, and some of the Gurdjieff groups deduced that it was the key to the future. 7 centuries before the Babylonian events was, they decided, a typical Gurdjieff blind. Various messengers and prophets known historically might be identified with efforts based on faith, hope, or love, but none was known who had made his appeal to human conscience. From this, it was decided that Ashiata Shamash was still to come. Near the end of his life, Gurdjieff had been asked what would become of the Gurdjieff people after his death. He was said to have replied, "Another will come. He is even now preparing." Other hints placed this expectation in India or some country with Indian associations. This combination of clues led a large number of Gurdjieff people in America, England, and France to identify the Indonesian teacher Muhammad Subuh with Ashiata Shamash, and this was almost certainly a factor in the rapid spread of Subud in the West. Other groups associated with the Gurdjieff material, but centered more on his pupil, P.D. Ouspensky, declined to make this identification, but found reason to identify with the Indian mystic Maharishi Mahesh. Various lecture courses at present, advertised throughout the country, for subjects far removed from anything metaphysical, apparently derive from yet another attempt to identify Ashiata Shiemash. It is difficult to avoid the conclusion that this represents the ultimate example of looking for a caravan in an empty oasis. In addition to such attempts to identify Ashiata Shiemash, several attempts were made to make contact with Gurdjieff's source in the East. These were without success, but the experience of those who tried probably underlines the principle that such sources cannot be found unless they want to be found. When they do, there is little difficulty. As it transpired, they did want to be found, but not apparently before 1961. In that year, a journalist and traveler seeking material for an article on Sufi practices met a Sufi in Pakistan and was unaccountably introduced to every facility for getting material for his article. This journalist, Omar Burke, found himself allowed to visit a secret dervish community whose location has been identified as Kunji Zag, Raven's Corner, in Baluchistan. He spent some days there and gathered various impressions of the community's activities. Soon afterwards, he wrote his article, which appeared in Blackwood's magazine in December 1961. Burke, in his description of the day-to-day life of this community, described various practices and one particular exercise which were clearly identifiable with Gurdjieff's system. The article was read by chance by a member of one of the London Gurdjieff groups, who realized that one trail to Gurdjieff's source, long thought to be concealed beyond hope of discovery, was in fact being given openly in a literary magazine. It is perhaps possible to imagine the excitement and the behind-the-scenes activity which this discovery produced. Contact was finally made with Akund Mirza, the wandering dervish who had so fortuitously met Burke in Pakistan, and additional information asked for. The reply was, if anything, more startling than the original discovery of a possible clue to Gurdjieff's source. The London group were told that it would be pointless to come to Baluchistan, as the current focus of activity was not in the East at all, but in England. A little later, but independently of the Burke incident, a seeker writing under the name of Raphael Lefort was to solve the same mystery in a much more direct way. This man had come to the conclusion that the section of the Gurdjieff movement with which he was associated was pursuing activities which were sterile and futile. He also felt that from being developmental under Gurdjieff, the activity had now become totalitarian. Braving the heretic label which his action would undoubtedly give him, he went to Turkey and sought the trail to Gurdjieff's source by the simple and direct method of going about asking people, "Did you ever hear of a man called Gurdjieff?" In a short space of time, he realized that his inquiries were being passed back in some way, and were leading to opportunities for him to meet people who had known Gurdjieff and who also knew a great deal about associated matters. Lefort's book, The Teachers of Gurdjieff, is an outstanding example of achieving big results by employing methods so simple that nobody else apparently thought of them. Lefort was passed along a line of a dozen contacts, at each of which his motives were tested and his vanity deflated. In the end, he came to the same source as the London group had arrived at by different methods. By 1962, the great mystery had thus been solved twice, although the solution had apparently been available all along. The whole story of the search for Gurdjieff's source is much like the Eastern story of the blind men and the elephant. People had touched a trunk, an ear, a tail, and had built up a theory of the nature of the beast. But the search was for bits and pieces. Nobody was looking for a complete elephant. The search also shows European scholarship in an unflattering light. Gurdjieff talked about teachings in Kafiristan. The Sufi tradition of Haji Bektash says the same thing. Anyone who had suspected the Sufic origins of G's system could have found this reference in a book published the period of G's stay at Fontainebleau. G also published a pamphlet, copies of which still exist, naming several Sufic orders and groups as the source of his dramatic presentation. While excellent minds in England, France and Germany were trying without success to arrange pieces of an intractable jigsaw puzzle, the existence of the completed picture was almost common knowledge in the East. An inner circle of humanity which kindles or restrains human activity is associated with the Sufi concept of the abdals, changed ones, and this is openly referred to in both oral and literary sources. The idea that dervish or Sufic brotherhoods represent a more or less visible link in this organization is part of common acceptance among quite ordinary people in the East. In fairness, it should be mentioned that the Sufic link seems to have been considered, but to some extent passed over. Rodney Collin had noticed certain significant points in dervish literature, and even published in Mexico a booklet containing dervish material. This was a selection from the Lives of the Gnostics by Aflaki, who was a disciple of the grandson of Jalaluddin Rumi, 1207 to 1273, founder of the Mevlevi order of dervishes. Rumi was the author of the great poem, the Mathnawi, which expresses the mystical path which the Mevlevis tread. Gurdjieff had taught movements, a stylized dance technique which requires extended energies of attention. The association of the G movements and the Mevlevi whirling was perhaps unavoidable, but we shall find reason to suspect, presently, that the movements have a different source, although G dressed his disciples in Mevlevi outfits, perhaps for misdirection purposes. Before Gurdjieff took over the prior at Fontainebleau, P.D. Ouspensky, the Russian philosopher and G.S. pupil, had decided that Gurdjieff's exposition was unsatisfactory on intellectual grounds. He believed that G lacked the ultimate key to the system he taught. He believed further that G had taken, or was about to take, a wrong turning, which, instead of obliterating egoism, would create it into an entity with grave consequences for all associated with him. He parted from G and formed his own groups of pupils. Ouspensky's decision to work independently seems today, even from the sidelines, to have been rash. He proceeded to exclude entire elements from the practice taught by Gurdjieff, a practice which, according to Ouspensky, was already defective. Ouspensky's hope was that by sheer intensity of personal effort, he would attract the attention of the source. Instead of looking for it, the source would look for him. By 1938, it had become apparent that this expectation had not been realized. Like other intellectuals who had studied Gurdjieff material, he was fascinated by the word Sarmoun, a secret brotherhood that Gurdjieff had mentioned and from which he had clearly obtained important gains. Ouspensky, like many others, suspected that the Sarmoun monastery was, if not the actual source, on the threshold to it. For some reason, he believed that the Mevlevi order of dervishes held the entree to Sarmoun. In the 1930s, it is believed that Ouspensky made contact with the Mevlevis and asked them to send someone to England. This they declined to do, but indicated that they were prepared to receive a representative from him. One of Ouspensky's senior pupils was ready to leave for the East in 1939 when war broke out and the project was abandoned. Although one section of Ouspensky's pupils is convinced that he broke through to a certain level of development as a result of almost superhuman efforts made in the last few months of his life, others are equally convinced that he died wholly disillusioned. Sufic sources have since indicated that the whole search for Gurdjieff's source, and later for his successor, was watched from various points in Central Asia with compassionate, if wry, amusement. One of their reported comments is, "The Western European and American phase of the Gurdjieff. Ouspensky operation was heroic in intensity. The source is not attracted by heroism, but by capacity and ability to respond to its messages." The seekers were quite right, a key was missing, but it was not the kind of key they imagined. What was missing was the realization that interventions, designed to inject a developmental impulse into the historical process, are discontinuous. Occasions relate to the fortuitous presence of energies on a much vaster scale, and perhaps from outside the planet. It is as though a solar wind blows on the Earth at intervals. When it does, agents of the Directorate, represented for the past 1,000 years and more by some Sufic organizations, can act to straighten out involutionary trends and produce an evolutionary gain. In the absence of this solar wind, there is no possibility of work, and hence no activity on the historical scale. The matter is not at the discretion of those who organize the fieldwork, much less of aspirants to participate, however industrious and well-intentioned. Both lines of search which finally traced back the source of Gurdjieff's teaching came to the same conclusion. It was a Sufic source. They also discovered that examination of the Gurdjieff material would have shown this all along. The central figure of all and everything is an archetypal figure called Beelzebub, who in his youth committed an indiscretion. By dint of conscious labor and intentional suffering of a heroic nature, he purifies himself to the point where he can be received back into the hierarchy of cosmic beings. Beelzebub describes his experiences on Earth to his grandson, Hassan. Two major historical figures in the East are Hassan and Hussein, grandsons of Muhammad. Further, Beelzebub is the anglicized version of Bil Sabab, which is Arabic for the man with a motive aim. Another example of this play on meaning is the famous Ashiata Shimash. When the leadership of a Sufi school is transferred from one teacher to another, the transfer is signaled by the phrase, Ya Shahim Sahiest. As an anagram, Ashiata Shimash is virtually intact even in English transliteration. In his writings, Gurdjieff repeatedly mentions meetings with dervishes. One of the most seemingly absurd accounts relates to a hermit living in primitive conditions in a cave. This man, however, lights his cave with electricity and gas. He also produces an abscess on the leg of a visitor by playing certain notes on a musical instrument, and then causes the swelling to reduce and finally disappear by playing another sequence of notes. While not perhaps discouraging speculation about possible symbolic meanings of the story, Gurdjieff told several of his pupils that it was a factual account of an incident he had himself experienced. One possible conclusion to be drawn from the story is that certain people who live in primitive conditions may possess sophisticated modern technology. They may also possess powers unknown to science and medicine because they have fallen heir to a wholly different kind of knowledge. The hermit in the cave is a dervish, that is, a member of a Sufi order. His name is Asvats Trouv. Bil Sabab, the man with the aim, is introduced to Asvats Trouv by another dervish, the Haji Boga Eddin of Bokhara. Boga Eddin is a Russianized version of Bahodin, the Russians substituting G for H, Gitler for Hitler. If we note that a very famous Sufic teacher was called Bahodin and that he came from Bokhara, the concealed reference to the origin of the dervish's powers becomes clear. Bahodin Naqshband was a Sufi teacher in the Khwajagan, Masters line, whose school greatly influenced the development of the Mughal and Turkish empires. The transmission from Bahodin is known as the chain or the Masters of the Design. He died in 1389, but his spiritual power or baraka is said to sustain, among other organizations, the Brotherhood of Sarmoun. Sarmoun, it will be recalled, was believed by many of Gurdjieff's followers to be the key to his teaching. Recent hints suggest that the word may also identify the powerhouse through which developmental activity in respect of at least part of the world is maintained. Hints of this are now appearing in ordinary sources. The American travel author Peter King in Afghanistan, Cockpit in High Asia, notes, "Nor is the snowman the only mystery in Nuristan, area of Afghanistan, till Second Afghan War called Kafiristan. Somewhere in these mountains are to be found the hidden monasteries or training centers of what Afghans refer to as the people of the tradition. These people, about whom one can learn little, are supposed to be the custodians of the secret traditions which are the basis of religion and man's development. In the most inaccessible spot of all is said to be the markaz or powerhouse of the people. The Sufis in Afghanistan are closely connected with these people, but no one will tell an outsider anything more than that these monasteries exist. They say that the only outsider to have penetrated into the outer ring of monasteries was a Russian Greek, George Gurdjieff, whose contacts enabled him to be accepted as a pupil. This is the same Gurdjieff who had some success with a form of philosophical teaching in the United States and Europe in the 30s. Said to have been trained by Bahodin Naqshband, one of the outer masters, Gurdjieff mastered some of the teachings and tried to teach them in the West. This teaching did not really catch on, and after his death his converts carried on in a desultory fashion and introduced some things to freshen up the image. It was not apparently till the 1960s that a group of his former students re-established contact with the original source of the teaching. This was both a shock and an ecstatic experience for them, for they found that the dervishes did not accept all the important successors of Gurdjieff as being worthy of being taught, let alone to teach. Clearly, in the last 10 years, information which has been held in impenetrable secrecy for centuries, perhaps millennia, is emerging into common knowledge. It is equally clear that this has not just happened, but has been engineered. It seems inconceivable, for example, that a Western newspaper reporter should just happen to discover extensive details of something that has never been more than a whispered hint all through history. Yet this happened in 1964. The London Times on March 9th of that year published an account by its own correspondent of a visit to a highly significant monastery in Kafiristan. The article includes the name of the abbot and virtually directions for getting there. Earlier, in January 1961, in a weekly English-language cultural periodical published in Delhi, S. Brooke White described the operation of Sufi methodology all over the world and revealed that it is active in England. In December 1965, the English magazine The Lady published an article by Major Desmond Martin, in which the author describes what amounts to a facility trip to a monastery of the Sarmoun Brotherhood. In 1961, a doctor was given facilities to watch a hitherto unknown form of medicine being practiced in a remote community in Afghanistan. The method involved hypnosis, but was far removed from the mere removal of symptoms by post-hypnotic suggestion. It recalled classical accounts of the Greek temple of sleep technique, which is ordinarily supposed to be symbolic. The practitioners, who trained for 16 years before being allowed to practice, were Sufis. In a book review in the London Evening News, February 10, 1969, the writer noted a number of significant hints that had been appearing in recently published books and seemed to suggest that these references were part of a deliberate policy of releasing information. From all of these published accounts and from other sources, it may be possible to suggest some tentative conclusions. In summary, these would be: the legend of the secret people has recently received considerable confirmation. Such matters do not, by their nature, leak by accident, and it is to be concluded that information has been deliberately released. A number of centers associated with this activity can be deduced. 1. In Baluchistan, in a place referred to as Kunj-i-Zagh, Raven's Corner. 2. By a waterfall locally known as Nimtut in the Parman Range, which begins about 20 miles northwest of Kabul. 3. At an unidentified location in northern Afghanistan, looking up to the Hindu Kush. This is the legendary monastery of Sarmoun, the acting head of which is a Sufi, identified as Baba Amin. 4. Adjoining the above, a similar community for women. 5. Northern Afghanistan, a location given as Abshaur. 6. A center in Persia. 7. A center in Iraq. The references from which the above list has been deduced may overlap, and it is possible that two at least are separate descriptions of the same location. One possible reason for deliberately exposing the general location of communities, which have for so long been kept secret, would be that the real activity associated with them has been moved elsewhere. Such an idea seems almost explicit in an incident reported by Major Martin in his magazine article already referred to. He was allowed to see certain possessions of the Sarmoun community which had never before been shown to the uninitiated. He reports they had been deconsecrated, as it were, because a new phase of teaching somewhere to the west had superseded the ritual to which they belonged. Henceforth, they would be merely museum pieces, our italics. Several speculations might arise from this. At the turn of the 12th century, the Mongol invasions took place, a turning point in history, the significance of which is not perhaps fully allowed by historians. In the Sufic hierarchy, at any rate above a certain level, this event and its long-term consequences were foreseen, and steps were taken in advance. A. To limit the worst excesses of the new regime at the level of everyday life, and B. To turn adverse conditions to ultimate advantage. When Genghis Khan swept through Central Asia and destroyed Balkh, the mother of cities, Sufic organizations had already acted in a certain way. 1/3 emigrated. 1/3 seemingly came to terms with the invaders. 1/3 went underground. There would seem to be at least the possibility that a similar situation is foreseen in the 20th century. If this is so, the cockpit of Asia, lying as it does between China and Russia, would probably be untenable for the organization of the people of the tradition. The theory of such a contingency, with its element of emigration, would be supported by the circumstance that something subtended by the Sarmoun and associated traditions began to establish in the West, including England, from about 1952. The Sarmounis, the bees, believe that the teaching they follow predates the flood. They assert that objective knowledge is a material substance and can be collected and stored like honey. This is done during periods of history when the world does not value honey. At critical junctures, the Sarmouni distribute the honey throughout the world by the agency of specially trained emissaries. Associated with the organization of the Sarmouni is a symbol called the No Kunja, literally nine-pointed diagram, also known as the Naksh, seal or design, which reaches for the innermost secrets of man. Social structures set up in various parts of the world by the agents of the tradition are later taken over by people without understanding. Such, the Times correspondent was told at Abshour, become in time only philosophical grinding mill, and from that stage become cursed. The Sarmoun tradition regards as degenerate dervishes who teach through Muslim scriptures, and dervishes who give public displays of dancing, etc. Such activities of the Sarmoun teaching, as are sometimes detected outside, are of a nature which leads Christians to regard them as disguised Mohammedanism, and Muslims to regard them as disguised Christianity. Certain activity throughout the world apparently causes concern. Due to recent trends of immigration, Asiatic populations in Western countries have tended to set up social and racial groups using Sufic terminology and Sufic forms of organization. To the Western mind, which has experience of such communities, the word Sufi tends to be associated with this imitative activity. Agents of the tradition are concerned about the effects of this. Since they used other labels of identification before the 7th century, it may be that the members of the tradition will be constrained to relinquish the word Sufi, a word which among themselves they seldom use. We have suggested that there is behind visible history a hidden influence which is concerned with evolutionary aims for the whole human race. We have suggested that recently clues to the identity of this influence have become deliberately available, and we have tried to show that the clues converge upon Afghanistan and associated geographical areas.